caught my best friend stealing from me. When I confronted him, he denied it and turned everyone against me. Now I'm alone, betrayed, and searching for answers. I'm a 30-year-old freelance graphic designer, and this year's Thanksgiving was a total mess. My family gets together every year, and my cousin Kevin's name always comes up. The way they talk about him makes you think he walks on water. Kevin works as a corporate lawyer and is the family's golden boy. He's tall, always well-dressed, drives a fancy car, and embodies almost every success stereotype that my family holds dear. Meanwhile, I'm just the person doing the art projects. This year, it began before Kevin arrived. We were sitting at the dinner table, and my mother made the first statement as soon as the food hit the plates. She did not waste any time. "Kevin really has his life together, doesn't he?" she asked, staring at me as if I should nod and agree. I just kept my head down and focused on the mashed potatoes. My freelance business has been doing well lately, yet none of them cares. All they see is that I don't make six figures in some high-powered profession, and that's all that matters to them. The night carried on, and the subject kept returning to Kevin. My aunts and uncles would not quit talking about him. "Have you heard? Kevin's firm is preparing him for partnership. Alternatively, and he just returned from a Maldives trip." It's as if they are enamored with him. I've learned to keep silent over the years. There's no point in trying to steer the topic when everything points to my cousin. But this year seemed different. I'm not sure why, but something inside me couldn't take it anymore. As if on cue, Kevin made his spectacular appearance. He arrived late, of course, and the instant he went through the door, all eyes were on him. He walked in, flashing the keys to his new sports car like he was the star of a reality show. Everyone came up to greet him. I remained sitting, observing on the sidelines as they virtually fawned over him. Nobody cared to ask me about my life or my job. I just secured a very great freelance gig with a popular independent brand. Yet it was as if I didn't exist. Then came the kicker. During supper, my mother leaned over and remarked, "Maybe if you had stuck to a more stable career, you could afford a place like Kevin's." I could feel my hands tightening into fists beneath the table. I didn't say anything, but my insides were boiling. It wasn't just one comment. It was years of hearing the same story. I understand what they think. Kevin is the success story, and I'm the guy who could have done more. But here's the thing. Kevin's life is not flawless. He's unhappy at his high-stress work, and I know he's been in more failed relationships than I can count. He's told me before about how lonely he is, but none of this matters to the family. They just see the surface, and they believe he has it all. Knowing this does not assist, however. Even while I understand his hardships, I can't shake the notion that I'm constantly in his shadow. Then my uncle joined in. He leaned down half joking. "You know, Kevin could probably get you a job at his company. Maybe it's time to get serious about work, right?" I tried to chuckle, but inside I felt like I was going to burst. It's as if they don't see me. I've developed a successful career, yet they don't consider it true work. They simply cannot respect it. After dinner, I found myself drinking more than I normally would. Everyone moved into the living room, where the talk naturally turned back to Kevin. They discussed his recent promotion, his new automobile, and the vacation he just enjoyed. I tried to join in at one point, casually mentioning the freelancing job I'd been working on, but before I could finish, my aunt interrupted to tell me that Kevin's firm is sending him to Europe for a large case. I felt invisible. That's when the memories came pouring back. Growing up, the story was always the same. Kevin was the kid I was always compared to at school activities, family holidays, and even birthday celebrations. It was always, "Look at Kevin, isn't he amazing?" Meanwhile, I was only there as the other cousin. I'm not sure what came over me, but I couldn't be silent any longer. When I eventually spoke up, the room became quiet. I said something like, "You people know I have my own life, right? It may not be a well-paying corporate position, but it makes me happy." The room lapsed into an uneasy quiet. My mother gave me the look that suggests she's disappointed without saying anything. No one knew what to say, of course. Kevin, as the golden child, attempted to smooth things over. He smiled and complimented my creative work, but it did not feel real. It seemed patronizing. That was when I snapped. I responded, "Thanks, but I don't need validation from someone who doesn't even know what happiness is." You could have heard a pin drop. Everyone was stunned. Nobody had ever spoken to Kevin like way, especially not me. My father swiftly drew me aside, muttering that I was causing a commotion, but I didn't care anymore. I was finished pretending everything was good. Without saying anything else, I grabbed my coat and walked out. I couldn't stand being in that house anymore. I was fed up with the continual comparisons and the sense of never being good enough. As soon as I arrived home, I opened Reddit and vented. I blogged about everything. How I'd been compared to Kevin my entire life, how Thanksgiving was the final straw, and how I was tired of being treated as if I didn't exist. The post received thousands of upvotes and hundreds of comments. People from all over shared their own family comparison stories, and I felt less alone than I had in a long time. Late that night, I received a text from Kevin. "I saw your post. We need to talk." My phone was constantly buzzing the morning after Thanksgiving. At first, I didn't even look into it. I knew what it was. After my Reddit article went viral, I expected some family members to see it, and they did. It was a mixed bag. Some responses were sympathetic, while others were filled with wrath. My aunt left a lengthy voicemail, unhappy that I had discussed intimate family affairs in public. Another cousin, whom I hadn't spoken to in years, sent me a message stating, "I understand. I've been there." That one startled me. Then came the message I had been dreading. From my mother. Her call arrived at 10 a.m., and I could already imagine what the talk would be like. I let it ring for a while before picking up. She did not hold back. She was unhappy that I had posted our family business online, and she demanded that I apologize to Kevin for embarrassing him in front of everyone. It was all the typical stuff, like how I needed to set things right and correct what I'd done. This time, though, things were different. I refused to cave. I refused to apologize, even after years of quietly living with the repeated comparisons. I made it apparent that I was over pretending things were good, and if they couldn't accept me for who I was, I'd have to walk away. She was quiet for a time, perhaps not expecting me to stand firm like that. However, the call ended with her expressing her disappointment in me. It pained, but I understood what had to happen. Later that night, Kevin called me. I wasn't sure what to expect, perhaps another lecture, or some passive-aggressive attempt to smooth things over. But Kevin simply wanted to chat. I almost did not pick up. A part of me wanted to just ignore him, but curiosity got the best of me. I responded, and after a brief, awkward chat, we decided to meet the next day at a local coffee shop. When I arrived, Kevin was already sitting at a table by the window, looking slightly less put together than normal. He wasn't dressed sharply, just a hoodie and pants, which was unusual for him. I sat down, and after a few moments of small conversation, he got to the point. He apologized. He stated he had no idea how much the family's continual comparisons had influenced me. I nodded, but I didn't entirely believe it. I figured he must be aware on some level. He'd always been the golden child, and I assumed he appreciated it, even if he didn't acknowledge it out loud. But then he said something that took me off guard. He complained about his profession, including the hard hours, constant pressure, and the fact that his parents prioritized his career over his happiness. It was eating him up. He even admitted that he had been considering quitting for a long time, but didn't know how to tell his family. He informed me that all the acclaim and attention he received didn't make him happy. In reality, it only made him feel more imprisoned. I just sat there stunned. For the first time, I felt like we were on the same page. I used to believe he enjoyed the attention, but after hearing him speak, I understood he too was frustrated just like me. We began talking more openly than ever before about how much pressure we both felt from our families. I told him how being compared to him my entire life had made me feel invisible, as if nothing I accomplished could ever measure up. Surprisingly, he said he envied me. He stated he wished he had the bravery to follow something he was passionate about, as I was with my design job, but he felt too constrained by the expectations placed on him. Then he dropped the bomb. He intended to quit his work and travel for a year to figure out what he truly wanted in life. I wasn't sure what to say. We were talking about Kevin, the guy who had everything, and now he was telling me he was about to throw it all away to go trekking or whatever. Part of me was stunned, but another part of me admired him for it. It required courage to walk away from a profession like his, especially because his entire family had been rooting for him for years. When he eventually told the family about his plan, everything went as expected. The same relatives who had been praising his praises only days before were now full of criticism. How could you throw away such a bright career? How about your future? It felt weird to watch. All of their admiration for him was disintegrating before my eyes. I couldn't help but feel satisfied. For once, Kevin wasn't being treated as if he were perfect. He was just like the rest of us, imperfect and attempting to figure things out. As Kevin began arranging his vacation, I found myself respecting him in ways I never expected. He was taking control of his life by doing what he wanted rather than what others expected of him. And for the first time, I didn't feel as if I were living in his shadow. The family had finally stopped treating him as if he were untouchable, which seemed like a victory, not just for me, but for both of us. A few days later, my parents arranged a family meeting to discuss Kevin's choice, as well as my recent defiance. I went, but this time I wouldn't sit quietly. I told them straight up that if they didn't quit comparing me to others, I was going to cut off contact. I was not going to allow them to continue to make me feel inadequate. There was a lot of tension in the room after that, but I wasn't concerned. I had finally uttered everything I needed to say. I left the conference with a peculiar sensation of peace. I had no idea what would happen next with my family, but for the first time, it didn't matter. I was finally living life on my own terms, and it felt great. Update 2. 2 weeks had passed since the family gathering, and I hadn't spoken with my parents. Honestly, the silence seemed like an odd combination of relief and anguish. On the one hand, I was emotionally exhausted by the entire process, but on the other, I finally felt at ease knowing I had stood my ground. The last thing I told them was clear: if they didn't stop comparing me to Kevin, I was going to terminate communication. It had left them astonished, and the silence. Yeah, they were trying to find out how to reply. In the midst of all that silence, my phone rang. That was my younger sister. She typically avoided family conflict, but this time, she called to express her admiration for how I handled things during the meeting. She told me she had also felt the burden of family expectations but had never been brave enough to speak up. Hearing that was surprising, yet it made sense. She's always been in the background, never making waves, so I guess I never considered that she may be feeling some of the same weight I was. Meanwhile, Kevin was already making moves. I received a message from him stating that he had sold his sports vehicle and was reducing his residence in preparation for his extensive trip plans. The guy didn't waste any time. I couldn't help but be surprised by how quickly he was going, but I had to appreciate it. He was truly taking control of his life and doing things that made him happy, which surprised me. It was bizarre to see him transition from the ideal corporate person to someone who consciously chose to walk away from it all. But the biggest surprise happened a few days later. I was sitting at home, surfing around Reddit, when my phone buzzed again. It was my father. My father isn't one for long chats or dramatic speeches, so when I saw his name come up, I didn't expect much. But when I opened the message, I was floored. It was a quick statement. "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself." That is it. It was a little message, but coming from him meant a lot. For as long as I could remember, my father had always been the silent sort, never displaying any emotion. So receiving this text from him felt enormous. Of course, not everyone agreed with the way things had gone. One of my aunts called and blatantly tried to guilt-trip me into apologizing to my mother. She went on about how family comes first and how upset my mother was, but this time I wasn't giving up. I stood firm, telling her that things had to change and that I would not continue to live under the same weight of expectations. I wasn't being rude, but I was direct. It felt like another tiny win to be able to set boundaries with them, even if they didn't appreciate it. I kept posting Reddit throughout everything, and the support I received from strangers was astounding. Every time I submitted an update, I received comments from folks who had been in similar situations. It felt almost like treatment. Seeing that other individuals knew what I was going through made me feel less alone. It provided me with confirmation that I hadn't had from my own family in years. Then one night, during one of our catch-up talks, Kevin smacked me with something unexpected. He suggested I join him on his travels for a few months. He thought it would be a perfect opportunity for both of us to get away from the family stress and simply reset. I wasn't sure how to answer at first. The idea of taking a few months off was appealing, but I had never been the kind to take impromptu travels, especially with someone with such a tangled history. Still, it remained in the back of my mind. A few days later, my parents' silence ended. My mother called, and it was not the angry, demanding call I had anticipated. Instead, she was in tears, pleading with me to come over and talk. She didn't understand why I was furious or angry, and she pleaded with me to make things right before they grew worse. I agreed to meet with her, but this time I set the terms. I told her I'd come over, but first we'd have an honest chat about how her incessant comparisons to Kevin had affected me over the years. She pondered before agreeing. When I arrived at the residence, things were tight. My mother was defensive at first, not understanding why I was making such a big deal about things. But as I laid it all out, how the Thanksgiving dinner went, how she always bragged about Kevin's success while never acknowledging mine, it began to set in. I provided her specific examples, demonstrating how the family's fixation on Kevin had made me like an afterthought for years. At first, she denied it. She insisted that she simply wanted the best for me and that she never intended to hurt me. But as the talk progressed, I saw a shift in her. She began to realize how her actions, albeit well-intentioned, had caused significant damage. She apologized, and while I accepted it, I knew it would take time to heal. My father was also present, sitting calmly as he usually does. He didn't say much, but when I mentioned how suffocating their expectations had been, he nodded. That tiny act meant far more than any words could have. It was his way of saying he understood. The meeting concluded on a cautiously hopeful note. My mother stated she was willing to work on things, and my father even promised to attend one of my freelancing art shows, something he had never done before. I left feeling optimistic, but I knew it would take time for things to really change. Later that night, I found myself reflecting on Kevin's offer to go. Perhaps this was the ideal time to take a break from the family conflict and focus on myself. I'd spent years coping with their expectations, and now I had a chance to break away, at least for a short time. I've chosen to go. I texted Kevin and said I'd accompany him on the first leg of his journey. I wasn't sure what to anticipate, but I decided it was time to find out. Update 3, departure day, came quickly. Kevin and I boarded the flight to Japan, our first stop. I'd never traveled much before, so the entire event felt weird. The exhilaration came in waves, accompanied by a small amount of anxiety. There we were, two cousins who had spent most of our lives entangled in family dysfunction, set to embark on this big journey together. Before we departed, we agreed on one thing: no family conversations. This was our opportunity to leave everything behind and simply enjoy the adventure. The first several days in Japan were a jumble of unfamiliar sights, sounds, and foods. We jumped right into sightseeing, temples, busy streets, and neon-lit nights. Kevin appeared calmer than he has in a long time. He wasn't constantly checking his phone or discussing work. I began to see a different side of him, one that was unrelated to his work or his family's expectations. I wasn't sure what to make of it at first, but it was a noticeable departure from the Kevin I knew. After a long day of touring, we ended up at a quiet supper location and ate bowls of ramen. Kevin finally talked about his choice to quit his work. It wasn't just the stress, he continued. It was the knowledge that he had been living a life controlled by what others desired for him. His parents, his colleagues, and even our extended family. Everything he had done up until now had been for their approval, and he had no idea what he wanted for himself. It hit me harder than I expected, owing to the realization that we were more alike than I had previously assumed. Although our journeys have been different, we both felt shackled by expectations. His is the perfect success story, whereas mine is constantly being compared to that achievement. The more we chatted, the more the barriers between us came down. For the first time, we were having a genuine conversation, rather than the surface-level conversations we'd had at family events. Kevin said that he had always coveted my ability to pursue my passions. He told me that while I might not have the money or prestige, I did have something he lacked: passion. In exchange, I revealed that I had always felt inadequate next to him. It was a real honest chat that brought us closer than ever before. Of course, things were not perfect. A few days later, we had our first major argument. Kevin, being Kevin, wanted to organize every element of our trip, including itineraries, backup plans, and spreadsheets of potential destinations. Meanwhile, I wanted to be more spontaneous, to go with the flow and explore without a set timetable. The conflict was inevitable. We ended up not speaking for the rest of the day because we were both too obstinate to back down. By the next morning, we were both done. We sat down to apologize. Kevin stated that his urge to control every aspect stemmed from his demanding career, where everything had to be perfect. I recognized that my dissatisfaction was not just about the vacation. It was deeper. It was about how I still felt compelled to prove something. We agreed to meet each other halfway. We eventually reached a compromise. Some days we followed Kevin's ideas, while others we let the day flow naturally. Once we found our groove, the trip was precisely what I needed. We trekked through the mountains, visited peaceful temples, and even made a surprise weekend vacation to the countryside. The longer we were traveling, the lighter I felt. It was like peeling away layers of anticipation with each new experience. I began to regain my joy, not just in life, but also at work. I even got out my sketchbook for the first time in months to draw scenes from the trip that had inspired me. Throughout, my phone rang with texts from home, largely from my mother. She sent updates on how things were progressing, but I kept my comments brief. I wasn't ready to go back into that environment just yet. Then one day, I received a message from my father. "Hope you're finding what you're looking for." It read brief and straightforward, but it had a lot of weight coming from him. I did not answer immediately, but the message lingered with me. As Kevin and I continued our journey, he began to worry about what he would do when it was all done. He didn't intend to return to corporate law, but he wasn't sure what the next step was. One night, I proposed that he consider consulting or teaching law part-time. For the first time, he appeared open to the notion. It was an odd shift. Kevin, who had always been certain of his path, was now exploring something quite different. But it felt like a change. One night, while scrolling through Reddit, I decided to share a reflection on how the trip had affected my outlook. I discussed letting go of the desire for family approval and how my relationship with Kevin had evolved from rivalry to mutual respect. It felt good to share, and the responses poured in again, full of encouragement and understanding. A few hours later, my mom texted me. She saw the post and told me